Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
And I think there's a lot to be said for, not only the spacing of information so that you are kind of exposing yourself to things more than once, but also, as I mentioned, this idea of retrieval practice, which I think is often missed, that, just looking at something is just less effective than trying to recall it from memory. So I think in a lot of language learning apps, for instance, they have basically these sort of multiple choice things where you just kind of like tap on words to translate them from a word bank, but when you're actually speaking, you don't have that word bank in front of you. So it turns out that that's much harder, and that's a big reason why it's very hard to actually have a conversation, even if you've done tons of that kind of, fun little phone gadget practice.
welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 370 with Scott H. Young. Scott is a writer, programmer, traveler, and avid reader of interesting things. For the last 10 years, he has been experimenting to find out how to learn and think better. He's the author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, Ultralearning, Master Hard Skills, Outsmart the Competition, and Accelerate. Whether it's learning a new talent, staying relevant, reinventing yourself, or adapting to whatever the workplace throws your way, Scott's book offers 9 principles to master hard skills quickly. We explored why self-education is so important today, common learning pitfalls, and techniques you can apply to accelerate your own learning efforts, including a simple method that can help you to increase your retention by a factor of 4. With that, I bring you the one and only Scott H. Young. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Oh, great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the program. I know you're joining me all the way from Vancouver, Canada, which I know Melbourne, Australia, and Vancouver are always battling it out for the top spot in the world's most livable cities rankings.
Well, it's a nice place to be here.
Definitely. Although I understand it's actually snowing there at the moment.
Yeah, it is very wintry, which is, I know people think of Canada as being snowy everywhere, but Vancouver is one of the few places where it's not that snowy, except for today where there's a few feet of snow outside.
Yes. And it is disrupting our internet connection to a certain degree. So hopefully we can get through this conversation without too many dropouts. But
yes, I hope so too.
We're here to talk about your new book. It is your first book called Ultralearning, Master Hard Skills, Outsmart the Competition, and Accelerate. Of course, the first question that I have to ask is, what is an ultra learner, Scott?
Yeah, so ultra learners are people who are really good at teaching themselves hard skills. So I found these people like Benny Lewis, who speaks 10 plus languages, people who have, learned all the different skills involved in making a video game and then built an entire business around it, people who've mastered public speaking in short periods of time. And so these are people who not only have learned something impressive, but they've often done it in unorthodox ways, meaning not going to school, not paying thousands of dollars in tuition and all of that sort of stuff. And so I think this is a very relevant skill in our world where school costs a lot of money and we often don't have time to go back and study everything we'd like to. And yet we live in a world where being good at things matters. It matters to be good at your job. It matters to learn new skills for your life. And so I think the idea of ultra learning, where you are taking on your own project to get really good at something on your own, is sort of an interesting area to explore.
So, I guess I'd like to rewind a bit and find out a little bit more about how you got into this topic of ultra learning and learning about learning, if you will.
Sure. So I think, I'd always been interested in kind of learning and being kind of curious, even as a kid. But my first introduction to what I would call ultra learning was meeting a fellow I know of called Benny Lewis, who I mentioned just briefly, who speaks multiple languages. And I kind of met him in a moment of frustration. I'd been living in France. I was doing a year abroad trying to learn French, and I was finding it really difficult. Most of the people around me just spoke to me in English all the time. And I heard about this guy who had this website very modestly titled Fluent in 3 Months, where he was going around from country to country trying to learn languages in as little as 3 months. And I was really kind of awestruck by this sort of approach to learning things, because he wasn't sitting in classrooms. He wasn't spending years and years studying to speak a language. And yet he seemed to be pretty good. He seemed to be able to speak multiple languages. And so he was sort of my first introduction to this idea that learning things not only faster, but learning them in kind of unconventional ways may be more effective than learning in the classroom or the traditional ways that we've been taught.
Yeah. So I know this is something you talk about in your book, where the old ways of working may not be the best. Sorry, the old ways of learning may not be the best ways of learning, especially for people who perhaps haven't really invested in self-education since they were in high school or college, and then they get back into it, and then they apply the same sort of techniques that they used during college, 10, 15 years later. I mean, what could be improved about the way we used to learn in school, Scott?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that we've never really been taught how to learn. I know that sounds kind of a weird thing, because we often spend years and years in school, but what we've learned how to do is, how do you sit in a classroom? How do you do the things that make the teachers happy so that they'll give you a good grade?
Yep.
But it's not really the same thing as asking yourself deep down, what do you need to get good at, or what do you want to get good at? And then how do you design an effort to get there? I think most people aren't really sure how to do that. And so I think this is one of the things you see when you see people, let's say, learning a foreign language. And you say, well, they have no idea how to learn another language. So, what do they do? Well, maybe they enroll in a class, and maybe that's the way to do it. Or maybe they download an app on their phone and then they play on that app. But very often they take a couple classes and they still can't have a conversation with someone, or they play with the app for 6 months and they still can't have a conversation with someone. And then they beat themselves up because they're not a good learner, or they're not good at learning that thing, whether it's languages or something else. And so I think it makes sense to understand the process of learning, because if you want to enjoy your life more, have more hobbies, have more fun skills that you're good at, or you want to improve your career, meaning you want to move ahead and get good at things that matter for your professional life, you have to be able to know how to learn and teach yourself how to learn. But that's often something that, has never been formally instructed to you. You just have been expected to figure it out.
Yeah, definitely. And I like what you said about signaling, essentially, whereby in school we learn how to get the grade, but not necessarily how to learn. And that's something that Brian Kaplan, who ironically is a professor at George Mason University, talks about in his book, The Case Against Education, in that we're all learning just a signal, but we're not actually learning the skills per se that we can then apply in the real world.
Well, so on a related note to that, there's a really interesting body of research on transfer of learning. So the transfer of learning is just the idea that when you learn something in one context, let's say in a classroom, you are hopefully going to be able to apply that in somewhere else, like in real life or in your job or something. And there is a huge amount of research showing that as sort of educational institutions, we haven't been that good at teaching for transfer, meaning that you get students to go through some sort of program and there's some obvious place that they're supposed to be able to use their newfound knowledge, and they don't seem to apply it. One of my favorite studies that was talking about was that they had students do questions of economic reasoning, and it turned out that economic students didn't do better on these than non-economic students, which is kind of crazy, because like, why do you study economics if it doesn't help you reason with economic questions? That would seem to be like right down the bullseye of what economics is for. And similarly, there was another study that showed that high school students, or students who took psychology in high school, did not do better at later college level psychology, which is also kind of baffling, because why take sort of a preliminary subject if it doesn't help you learn the later subject? And there was another one showing that honors level physics students were unable to solve physics problems that just differed superficially from the ones that they learned in school. And so we're not even just talking about kids that, these were the poor kids in the class that are dragging down the average. These were the honor students. These were the best students. So the idea of transfer is, I think, really worrying when it comes to learning, because it seems that even in the school context, the way we've been taught to learn maybe isn't even that effective. And so I think, I've been talking about the case of learning languages, but it applies to much more, that often what we're doing is we've learned that the way that learning should be taking place is sitting in a classroom, taking notes, and just sort of passively absorbing this information, when the research on learning shows that that's probably not the best way to build real skill.
And I mean, to me, it sounds like that may have to do with the fact that in the classroom, like you said, we take notes, we tend to remember things in order to regurgitate them in a standardized testing environment, but then shortly thereafter, we forget everything we learn, and therefore I may have studied psychology in high school, but then when I come across the same content in college, I've completely forgotten.
So I think there's lots of pitfalls that we get into in learning, and that explains a lot of our frustrations. And so a lot of what I try to spend in the book is try to identify what are these sort of little pitfalls you can get into, and how do you avoid them so that you can actually, feel like you're making progress. And one of them that I think is super interesting is this idea of retrieval, because I think even if we're talking about just purely in school, so this is sort of almost the easier case, because when you're in school, that's the thing that we've actually learned how to do. It turns out the students don't study very well. So one of the very common modes of studying that students do is just passive review, where you just have your notes and you read them over and over again. Now, sometimes students might, highlight that or retranscribe their notes into a new format, but it's basically the same activity. You have the book open and you're reading what you're learning. And in some intriguing experiments, it was shown that this actually is much worse for your overall performance than doing what is called retrieval practice, where you have the book closed and you try to remember what was in the content. It turns out that trying to remember with the book closed is much, much better practice for a test than just reading it over and over again. But the interesting thing about that is that the students who do the passive review think they've learned it better than those who do the retrieval practice. So in some ways, our intuitions are part of the reason that we get led astray, because we think we're learning something. We think we're amassing knowledge. We think we're getting better at this, but then the test comes and we fail it and we don't know why. And so I think this happens to many people, not just in school, but in real life. And they get into a project to get good at something, and they don't seem to get much better, and they're not sure how to get over that obstacle.
Yeah, and I guess that echoes what the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus put forward in the 19th century on the forgetting curve, where he found that if new information isn't applied, we tend to forget about 75% of it after just 6 days.
Oh, yes. And definitely the fact that we forget information so quickly too is a sort of a chronic problem. And that's one of the things that the ultra learners I interviewed and talked to in the book had kind of creative ways of overcoming it. One of the popular tools that can be used if you're trying to learn something that has a lot of stuff that you have to remember is spaced repetition software, which is basically a software that optimizes that forgetting curve that Ebbinghaus discovered, which allows you to study in a more efficient manner so that you can make sure that you don't forget things, but also that you're not, spending every single waking moment trying to study it in order to keep it in your head.
Yeah. And spaced repetition, I mean, that goes back to the work of Cecil Mace. I think it was in the 30s or something like that. But essentially, it's about learning something, but then having repeat exposures to that learning over intervals of time. And therefore, I think you can retain something like 70 or 80% of that after a couple of months, rather than losing 75% of it after, say, 6 days, as per Ebbinghaus's work. Is that essentially?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, that's true. And I think there's a lot to be said for, not only the spacing of information so that you are kind of, exposing yourself to things more than once, but also, as I mentioned, this idea of retrieval practice, which I think is often missed, that, just looking at something is just less effective than trying to recall it from memory. So I think in a lot of language learning apps, for instance, they have basically these sort of multiple choice things where you just kind of like tap on words to translate them from a word bank. But when you're actually speaking, you don't have that word bank in front of you. So it turns out that that's much harder. And that's a big reason why it's very hard to actually have a conversation, even if you've done tons of that kind of, fun little phone gadget practice.
Yeah. And I think for our audience, and, even in my experiences with, say, keynote talks and presentations, you can fool yourself into thinking that you're ready for it by preparing with the notes up on your screen, with the PowerPoint presentation open, but rehearsing with the PowerPoint presentation closed, like that's a whole different ball game. And that to me makes you way more prepared to just nail it when you're out there in front of that audience.
So I actually have a funny story about that. I was going to give a keynote presentation, and it was kind of about this topic. And I was rehearsing. It was a big talk for me, and my wife listened to me rehearse it a couple times. And after I did the talk, she was kind of joking that like, "Oh, I've heard you do it so many times. I could do your talk. Like I could do it from memory." And I was like, "Oh, that's impressive," because it was a half-hour talk. There's a lot of stuff to do. And then when she started doing it, it was like, "Oh wow, this is actually kind of like hard to remember." And it was so funny because it just totally mirrored the experiments on review versus retrieval, because just sitting and listening to it, it felt increasingly familiar. So it was like, oh yeah, I know that speech by heart. But then when you actually have to produce it, you're like, oh wait, what comes next? And that is a real challenge, I think, for a lot of people, that we get increasingly familiar with things, or we get increasingly familiar with things in a way that doesn't necessarily translate to the skill we want to apply. So we think we're getting better at it, but then when we get to the real situation, we sort of flounder. And so I definitely see this in language learning, and I think I see it as well in a lot of academic subjects where you maybe spend a lot of time in the classroom and you get kind of better at those classroom situations, but then when it comes to the real situation, you have to transfer it. Often you struggle because the real situation differs in some important ways that maybe you're missing out on.
Yeah, and I mean, it's midway through January now, and no doubt heaps of people made resolutions to read more books in 2020.
Yes.
But, I guess building upon what we've been discussing, while you're reading that book, you might understand the concepts, you might feel a little bit smarter than you normally feel. You put the book away feeling accomplished, but then a few weeks later, someone might ask you something, or you might try and recall what you actually learned reading that book, and you're probably going to forget the vast majority unless you apply some of the techniques that you're talking about.
Yeah, and a real simple one if we're talking about reading books. And I mean, I'm in this situation as well. I read lots of books for not only my own interest, but, for research and these kinds of things. A real simple trick is just, after you've finished reading, or before you start reading the book again, when you pick it up, just spend 30 seconds and just be like, what was in the last chapter? And just try to recall from within. And even doing a little bit, I mean, obviously it's not the same as, rigorously studying it if you had to master it for a test, but I think it's a major improvement over the more superficial method of, oh, that sounds kind of hard and frustrating, I'm not going to do that. Yeah. But then you end up spending hours and hours reading a book that you can only remember maybe 20% of the contents. Like, what's the use of that?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I like to do is, highlight key excerpts and then turn those highlights into a short blog post, or teach those highlights to other people. I think it was Seneca who said, we learn as we teach, and just trying different approaches, I think, like that I find that it tends to ramp up the retention. Otherwise, if I'm just reading cover to cover, not taking notes, not highlighting anything, not teaching other people what I've learned, not turning it into a blog post or a podcast episode or something like that, it is like 90% gone.
Oh, I completely agree. And, for me, I'm kind of in the same boat. Whenever I have a book that I really want to remember the contents of it, I often write about it, because that's just the way that you will learn it is not by just reading it, but by trying to synthesize, explain it to yourself, reiterate, and again, recall from memory rather than just sort of transcribe what is out there. And I think this is something, for all of us, whatever you're learning, this is something that applies, is that we have to kind of understand what are these fundamental principles and not just rely on our intuitions, because again, our intuitions can lead us astray. Like the example I was saying about the speech, if you hear some speech, several times, you get the feeling that you know all of it, and that can be misleading.
100%. So Scott, earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that we can learn bodies of knowledge without having to spend tens of thousands of dollars to go to college. And I know this is something that you personally pursued, where you took on a 4-year MIT program in just 12 months. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is right after I graduated from university. I had studied business, and I'd kind of gone in thinking this will make me a good entrepreneur. And it was only after a few years of it that I realized, oh, it's really training you to be a middle manager in a big corporation. And so I was a little dispirited, because the thing that really got me excited about entrepreneurship was, people working with technology, building their own website, software. This is the thing that interested me. And I kind of felt like, wow, that was the thing I should have studied. And I was even thinking, I was going online and thinking about, okay, how could I maybe go back to school? But I mean, you want to spend more money on tuition, you want to postpone your life for 4 years. Is that really what you want to do? And that didn't seem that exciting either. And around this time, I found that MIT actually posts a lot of their classes online for free. So if you go to MIT OpenCourseWare, they just put them online, and you can watch the lectures, you can take the assignments, they have the solution keys, they have the exams, they have the solution keys. And so I kind of was sort of toying around with this, and I was wondering, has anyone ever tried to like simulate an MIT education before, like try to get the equivalent of an MIT degree in computer science, but not go to MIT, just do the program? And so the MIT challenge is what I called this project, and it was to try to pass the final exams and to complete the programming projects. And admittedly, that's a little bit of a skeleton of an MIT degree, but I would say that if you could pass the final exams, do the programming projects, that would be a pretty good start for the things that you would learn at MIT. And so this was a project that I started in October of 2011, and I ended in September of 2012, and I finished the classes. So it wasn't just that I was able to get the information, but I felt that by having the flexibility to do it on my own and really kind of optimize some of the things that we're talking about here, I was able to do it faster than the kind of normal pace that I would say is kind of, expected for that kind of degree, which would be probably 4 years.
No, that's a fascinating story. And I think one thing that stands out is that you build it as a project as such. Like I know you talk about Ultralearning projects, and you mentioned language learning a few times. And while I definitely don't remember much Portuguese, when I went to Brazil for the World Cup in 2014, in the lead up to that, knowing I was going there, I doubled down on Duolingo and different apps and retention and all that sort of stuff. And when I was there, I was actually having conversations in broken Portuguese with cabbies and restaurateurs and things like that. And it was fun, but I think having a project or, going to visit that country or whatever the case was made you just double down on those learning efforts versus not really having any project or place that I was going to apply my learnings.
I completely agree with you. And I think that's something that's sort of often underappreciated, is that very often we approach learning from a kind of haphazard, okay, I'm just going to, maybe download this app and maybe do a little bit of this. And I think that isn't very effective. I think it can work if the thing you're trying to learn is really effortless, or if you are kind of already going to do it. And so it was just sort of, okay, yeah, I'm already going to be doing this at my job, so I'll learn it kind of automatically. But I think for the things that really make a difference, they're not going to be automatic. They're things you're going to have to put in effort, and they're going to require some kind of structure. And so I think that's one of the keys to success for this kind of project is making it a project. You're actually dreaming of, okay, what is the skill I want to get good at? What is the sort of method or methods I'm going to use to get good at it? And how do I, set aside time? How do I make sure that there's effort being put in? How do I kind of get over some of those obstacles that I might have from doing it? And it sounds like it's a lot of work. And I mean, it can be. I think it's definitely not totally easy to learn all these things. But I think when you go through that process mentally before you start, it's often not the sort of painful struggle you imagine it is. It's a sort of a fun adventure. It's a fun project where you're doing something on your own, and you're doing something that matters to you, as opposed to just because it was assigned to you in a classroom.
Yeah. And it kind of echoes something I wrote about for Harvard Business Review on learning and development functions and why they're broken. And one of the stats that I captured there was around how 12% of employees apply new skills learned in their learning programs to their jobs. And oftentimes we're just learning these skills because, we need to tick a box, but we're not in a function where we can actually apply those skills. Like we don't have a quote unquote project where we can then get better at applying these things. And there's no feedback loop where we apply something, there is a struggle, like you said a few moments ago, but that struggle is something that you either have a positive relationship with or you don't. But if you do have a positive relationship with it, you do have a growth mindset, you learn from that feedback and you keep getting better. And I guess whether it's individuals and entrepreneurs out there learning things, or whether it's corporate executives in the corporate world, like it is really important that you actually can apply this in the real world. Otherwise, you're more likely than not just forget it, and it's just going to be a waste of time.
Oh, absolutely. And I think about this, every time you read a business book, how many times do you read a business book? And then if you think 6 months later, okay, what material impact did this make on your effectiveness as an executive or as a leader or as an employee? And often it's a bit of a question mark there. And I think the idea there shouldn't be, well, obviously reading books is good. I don't want to make someone feel bad if they read a book and they couldn't find some way to immediately apply it. But I think this is why I like projects, because it's not just, okay, well, I'm going to read this book and then that's done. You're going to go out and do something. You're going to go get some feedback in the real world. You're going to try to do something you couldn't do before. And so if you're speaking a language with someone and you couldn't do that before, well, then yeah, that's something you can do now in the world that you weren't able to do before. If you can write a computer program, if you can, lead a team on a difficult project that's, was something that you couldn't imagine yourself doing 6 months ago, that's a difference. And so I think often the idea of a project is sort of, it is around some kind of concrete application or result as the sort of central point, rather than a list of books or classes to attend, which is how often we conceptualize learning.
Yeah, 100%. So earlier, Scott, you mentioned that there are a number of pitfalls that we tend to fall into when we're trying to learn something. I mean, what are some of the other pitfalls that we should be wary of?
Right. So I mentioned a little bit this problem of transfer, and I think this is one of the big ones that a lot of people have said that have really helped them from the book, is my kind of approach for dealing with this issue of transfer. And to remind everyone, the idea of transfer is just that when we learn things in one context, they often, to quote one researcher, stay welded to that context. So you go to a different context and it suddenly seems like you can't apply the things that you learned. And so the way around that is to practice things directly. And so I think, again, going back to just the point we just made, that if you can think about concrete applications, where am I going to use this skill? What are going to be the kinds of situations? How am I going to be using this skill? So even when we were talking about like taking theoretical knowledge and writing in a blog post, even going to that step of saying, well, how I'm probably going to use this knowledge is I'm going to use it to think about things and create kind of new intellectual product or to contribute ideas to my workspace. Okay, well, then I can do some sort of project where I'm writing something or discussing something, and then that's sort of the concrete outcome. And that's even just for theoretical ideas. That's a huge example. The other one we talked about, retrieval, was so important, that being able to actually recall from within rather than just review, very important idea. Feedback is very important as well. I think people tend to accept that feedback is important. Now, it turns out that feedback is kind of an interesting area of research. I kind of went in expecting the research to be like very clear about feedback, but it turns out that there's lots of situations where feedback can backfire, where if you give someone feedback, then they can sometimes lower their motivation or not want to pursue a task. And so I think this points out that many of the difficulties we have with feedback are about the emotions related to feedback and not so much about just purely getting information. So how you can design your project not only to get feedback, but so that you don't kind of get hung up on that feedback, I think is very important.
Yeah, I know in your book you've put forward 9 principles, and principle 6 is about feedback, and you've called it "Don't dodge the punches." And I mean, how much of this has to do with people's, kind of hinted at it earlier, relationship with difficulty, relationship with adversity, and just knowing that, hey, if you are learning a language, there are going to be challenges, and just conceding that difficulty is a necessary obstacle on the way to improvement is all the difference, rather than, oh, this is difficult, I don't like the way it makes me feel, it hurts my ego, I'm just going to quit.
I think mental framing is really important too, because very often it's not so much the feedback we're getting, but how that gets interpreted through all our biases in psychology that really makes a difference. So an example from my own life, I remember when I was years ago learning French in France, and I was in a French class, and I was the worst in the class. And it doesn't feel good to be worst in the class. If you've ever been the worst in the class, and it was the kind of thing, like I would go up and they were like, okay, you go up and give a presentation now. And I'd give some little short speech, and then the teacher would be like, okay, what mistake did you make? And I'd be like, I don't know. And then they'd be like, well, you said this instead of this. And I was like, I didn't know that was a thing. Like, it was just, it was kind of like, you're kind of tisk-tisking me about this, and I didn't even realize I was making a mistake. And it feels bad. And then it was only after a few months in that I realized, oh, the reason why I'm the worst in the class is that most people in this class have studied it for like 2 or 3 years before going into the class. But I didn't know that from the beginning. And I think a lot of us, once that frame was, oh, I have way less experience than everyone, so it doesn't matter. This isn't like a sign that I'm dumb. This is just a sign that, I need more experience. And I remember talking to a woman who was a civil engineer, got her master's in civil engineering. And she told me that she couldn't do programming, like intro programming class, because it was too hard. She found it too hard in the class, which is kind of crazy because if you've done a master's of engineering, that's clearly harder than an intro programming class. And I think the reason is that you go to an intro programming class, there's always some like tech wizard who's been, writing code since he was 9. And that's the person you're competing with in the class. So of course, when you don't get things right away, you feel like, oh, I must not be smart enough for this. So I think for a lot of us, it's how we frame the feedback we're getting, not just the feedback itself. If the feedback is, if you kind of have the idea of, okay, I'm doing an interesting experiment and failure is the goal, and it's going to be kind of, I'm going to get kind of roughed up a little bit, but it's going to be fun and exciting, and that's sort of the point of it, you're going to feel a lot better than if you have this idea that, well, I have to be good, because if I'm not good at this, then, it's going to mean bad things for me in my future. And so I think even just framing it as a learning project where frustration and failure are going to be part of it is so important.
Yeah. And how important is the, picking the right entry point as well, Scott? I mean, there's a lot of research out there on the psychology of flow and how if it's just slightly beyond your capabilities, you tend to get into the flow state and therefore enjoy the process and open up those pathways for learning, versus if it's too easy, you kind of get bored. If it's too difficult, you get disgruntled and you're more likely to quit. I mean, how important is it to pick that right entry point?
I think so. Again, there's sort of two ways I view it. So one way I view it is the idea that the more you can adopt the mindset of frustration is fun and it's okay to make mistakes, and I'm just going to dive in even though it's really hard. The people that I met who were able to do that more were usually able to succeed more, because when there were temporary patches of frustration, they just plow right through them. But I also will admit that, it can be the case that you construct your project in such a way that it's just way too difficult for you. And so I think this can happen in a lot of ways when you're, again, starting to learn a new language, is that the thing that's most valuable for you to do to practice is to practice communicating, actually practice having conversations. And that's the thing that you can't do in the beginning. So there's sort of this paradox of this bootstrapping problem. And so one of the things that I think is very key is, how do you take a task that's too frustrating and structure it in such a way so that it is getting the right level of difficulty. So with language learning, the thing that I found very valuable is to use Google Translate as the kind of crutch to overcome. You're still having a conversation, but you're doing a lot of it through Google Translate by, typing what you want to say and then reading it out as a way of just kind of filling in for your lack of vocabulary. And that way you can kind of simulate a conversation. You're not doing everything yourself, but you're simulating it and getting a lot closer than just, reading from a textbook.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess I wanted to deep dive, well, not necessarily deep dive, but just double click on the concept of the 80-20 principle insofar as it applies to learning. I know years ago I read something that Tim Ferriss wrote called Discafe, where he said, look, if I'm looking to learn Japanese, I'm going to pick, the 20% of words that show up 80% of the time and focus on them rather than trying to read the entire body of knowledge. And then I'm going to take those 20% of words and go over to Japan and try and apply it in the real world. I mean, how does that show up in your research in terms of picking the right things to learn that can give you that edge faster than trying to learn everything?
Yeah, so that's definitely true. It's definitely the case that some things are far more frequent than others. There's, languages have this kind of like zip flaw, which is basically that things get drastically less likely to be heard or seen as you get further in the frequency chart for languages. And this is true for most skills. I mean, if you're a programmer, you spend most of your time writing the same syntax, and then there's a few things that you use very infrequently. And so I think one of the, obviously a key thing would be to start with the most frequent things. One of the strategies that I've found really effective for achieving that, however, is not, because it can kind of be overwhelming. It's you're like learning a language. Okay, what are the most frequent words? And then you get a list of like the most frequent words for English, and it's like the, of, ah. And like, so if you just know those words, that doesn't help you that much.
Yeah.
Because you know a bunch of prepositions that happen all the time, but you don't know any content words. And so it can kind of backfire if you just go with those lists. On the other hand, I found the most effective strategy is if you can do things by learning directly. So again, like our conversational simulation technique, that works because you naturally engage in the most common situations. So the words that you need to use every day, they come up more and more often. And those are the ones that you practice. And so it's the person who studies from a textbook and they're learning words because it's a list of vocabulary. They're the ones who have to be really careful that they're not doing it in the right frequency. Whereas if you're actually using it, you don't really have that problem. And indeed, it can actually be a real advantage because the words that are most frequent, you overlearn. So overlearning is this concept from psychology that as you get proficient with something, so you're able to do it. So you remember that, water is agua in Spanish. You know that in the beginning, but as you get better and better, you become more and more fluent with it. So it just comes more and more automatically, and you remember it longer and longer. And so those really common words and really common phrases and really common patterns in whatever you're learning are going to get really, really reinforced. So you're going to be able to do a lot better. And so I think directness, this idea of learning through direct interaction with a project, is so valuable there because it can solve some of these 80-20 problems.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I guess in the world of personal development and self-improvement, there's a lot of talk about just focusing on your strengths and not necessarily bringing your weaknesses up, because that's just going to make you the same as everyone else. So just focus on those strengths.
Yeah.
But in your book, Principle 4, you talk about drill, which is attack your weakest point. What can you tell us about that, Scott?
Right. So I think the whole discussion about strengths has a little bit more nuance. And I think this is sort of my understanding of it. It is true that we live in a world where you can specialize. I don't have to grow my own grain to make my own bread. I don't have to, invent the computer that I'm using right now. We live in a world where if I'm not good at something, someone else is good at it and they can compensate for it. And so in this sense, yes, focusing on your strengths is good. It's good to, if you're good at technology, maybe becoming a programmer. If you're good at communication, maybe becoming a manager. Or this kind of thing is very important. However, within a skill, so when you are practicing a skill, there's often many different components of that skill, and they're all necessary to do it well. So it doesn't make sense to say, well, I'm good at speaking Spanish, but I can't, I don't know any words. Or I'm good at speaking Spanish, but I don't know any grammar, or I don't know any pronunciation. All three of those are necessary to speak Spanish. So if your weakness is pronunciation, it's going to drag down your entire Spanish ability. And similarly, if you're a programmer and you don't know how to use certain aspects of programming that are essential to your job, well, you can't just say, well, yeah, but I'm good at the other stuff, so I'm just going to do those if they're necessary for your work. So what I think that the idea of drill is to recognize that there are certain inescapable weaknesses. There are parts of the skill that you are good at. So maybe you're in general good at this, but there is one aspect of it that you're particularly weak at. So I'm a writer, for instance, and I would say one of the things that I struggle with is writing pithy sentences. I like to write long sentences. And so that might be a weakness that I have to work on, because it's not like I can write an essay and then have someone come in and then chop up the sentences and rewrite it so that it's pithy like that. And similarly, there's these sort of unavoidable things you might recognize. Okay, well, I'm pretty good at this, but if I were much better at it, it would make my skill a lot better. If I was much better at storytelling, if I were much better at, this particular aspect of the skill I'm learning, it would be a lot better. So I don't think the idea is that, I'm a terrible dancer, so I should go learn dancing. The idea is that if you have within a skill these sort of weak links that are kind of straining the overall strength of your effort, then that's the thing that you should be trying to reinforce.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, for, say, an entrepreneur listening who spends a lot of time trying to close deals, they might be comfortable dealing with people via email, but when it comes to the phone conversation, they might struggle a little bit more, and therefore that's a weakness that they need to work on. At the same time, that's probably something that they find uncomfortable, which ties into one of your other principles, which is experimentation and exploring outside your comfort zone. I mean, is getting outside of your comfort zone, does that tie in with addressing those weaknesses?
Definitely. And I think the idea of experimentation is that everyone kind of wants a recipe. They want the step-by-step. And I've even had that, talking about these methods and these principles, is that people are like, well, give me the, step 1, do this, step 2, do this. And the problem is not that, I can make a list of steps. It's not that you can't make any list of steps. The problem is that that's not really what gets the result. It's just like knowing the steps for solving a problem in physics does not make you a good physicist. It's understanding the principles of physics that makes you a good physicist. And similarly, in many areas of life, it's having this kind of deeper knowledge that matters. And so the idea with learning in many cases is that I can give these principles. I can talk about retrieval and directness and feedback and focus and all these principles that I talk about in the book, but ultimately how they interact to find the best way to do your project is going to be something that you have to discover. And so you need to be able to experiment. You need to be able to adjust your approach. You need to be able to try things that, maybe feel a little bit uncomfortable at first in order to be able to figure out what's the best way for you.
Yep. Makes sense. So, I've done some research on, learning and development in large companies and things of that sort. And it turns out that when someone has a question or a skill they need to plug, or a gap they need to plug rather, employees tend not to Google it. What they tend to do is they will ask a colleague. In fact, more than 50% of people will ask a colleague. From your research, I mean, what's the relationship between teaching other people things you know and therefore solidifying your own understanding of that concept?
Yeah, so I don't know. I haven't looked at the research in depth on that particular point, but I would say that is sort of a dominant approach that I take towards learning things. And you can see that in a lot of the people who are quite skilled at projects, is that they are quite skilled at teaching it and explaining it to other people. And I think one of the reasons for that is that one of the kind of recurring lessons of cognitive psychology generally is that a lot of our mind is unconscious, meaning we can't really introspect and see what's in there. So the idea of retrieval is the idea that you don't actually know how well you're remembering something until you try to remember it.
Yeah.
You even think you remembered it really well, but you don't. And so the similar kind of analogous notion here is that you don't know how well you understand an idea until you try to teach it. You don't really understand it until you try to create an explanation. And so I think the talking to other people is very often how you clarify ideas. And that can happen directly. So you go up to a colleague's desk and you're trying to explain how to do something, or it can happen indirectly. So I find writing very valuable for that, because I often don't even realize sort of what I think about something until I start writing it, because you have to actually get it out there to actually see it and be like, no, actually that isn't good. I don't like that, and I'm going to rewrite it or something.
Yeah.
And so I think this sort of active approach to learning, where you're creating things, you're testing yourself, you are teaching other people, is very valuable, because it gives you this access to parts of your mind that are otherwise hidden.
Yeah, and I think it was Adam Grant who said that clear speaking is a sign of clear thinking. So if you're able to clearly articulate what you've learned to someone else, then you understand it. But if not, then perhaps you didn't understand it as much as you thought you did when you were consuming that knowledge in the first place.
Definitely. And there's a really interesting set of research as well on the illusion of explanatory depth. And basically, it's a really kind of cute study where they ask participants to draw a bicycle. And it's something like, we've all seen bicycles, and they're not trying to do like an artistic rendering of a bicycle, but just, do you know where the chains and wheels and pedals go and stuff? And it's amazing how bad people are at like drawing how a bicycle works. Like, they put the chains connecting to both wheels, which makes the bicycle totally non-functional, and all sorts of humorous things like this. But the point they're trying to make is that we think we understand bicycles. Like, if you said, oh, you know what a bicycle looks like at that level, you'd be like, yeah, I know what a bicycle looks like. But we're not able to actually do it. And so I think the idea from this study is that if we're thinking about factual knowledge, so like, what's the capital of France? Either Paris comes into your head or it doesn't. And so you can give an answer. When it comes to explanations, when it comes to skill, when it comes to these kinds of things, you may understand it a little bit, but not entirely. So it's very difficult to answer that question. And so this is why you need these kind of concrete touches with reality to actually see, oh, do I know this or not?
Yeah, and I guess it can be quite humbling for people. And I guess this is one of the things with human beings, evolving over time and becoming ever more specialized in very small things, is while we have access to so many things and bicycles and, healthcare and, the grocery store around the corner, the reality is that we don't know how any of it works. We probably know how 0.001% of the world works, and everything else we are completely clueless to.
Yes, that's totally true. That's totally true. I think that, there was some really interesting essay. It was talking about, how is a pencil made? And it was just talking about all of the things that go into making a pencil. And it's just amazing how complicated it is to make something even as simple as a pencil. And so this isn't to say that you need to know literally everything to live a good life and do your job well and do these kinds of things. But I do think it kind of opens us up to the idea that the things that are knowable, the things that we could learn, the things that we could get good at, are just so much vaster than we kind of naively anticipate, because we have kind of our own little pocket of the world that we live in, and we feel comfortable there, and we just don't realize how much more there could be to do or improve.
Yeah. And I mean, on education, one of its criticisms, particularly when it comes to, K to 12 classroom education, is that we try and teach everyone at the same pace as if every single person is the same. And now I guess we're seeing a bit of a shift to personalized content, guided learning, apps that support spaced repetition and things like that, which provide more of a personalized experience for people. I mean, what's your view on the step change or moving in that direction when we are providing that personalized experience?
Well, I think computers as a sort of a medium for education is really underexplored. And I think a lot of the challenge is that it's so new that a lot of the stuff that people are coming out with that are like kind of ed tech, it's not very good. Like they're still in this sort of early experimental phase. So we haven't really figured out how a lot of that works. The perspective I take on it is not so much at the institutional level of like, how can we reform the education system, but on the individual level of, if you want to get good at something, how do you leverage personalization, customization technology to achieve those ends? And I think there is quite a bit that you can do in that regard. And so, even just sort of the idea of like my project with the MIT challenge it took a little bit of thinking to get that kind of sense of this is the goal that I want to pursue. But by sort of making certain constraints and certain changes, I was able to get what I wanted, which was to get that kind of computer science education without a lot of the extra fluff. And similarly, if you're trying to learn a lot of skills, you can often sort of optimize for what you want to learn, what actually matters for you. And some of these ideas like directness and spacing and these kind of things can often help in making that more efficient.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, just on that point of knowing what you want to learn, ultimately reflecting on what is the objective. I mean, if I, take a wild example, if I want to play guitar in a punk band, then I basically just need to learn 3 chords. I don't need to, sit down and learn Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or how to read sheet music. If I know those 3 chords, I'm well on my way.
No, and I think that's true though. Like I think often our sort of the way we've approached education is to sort of overteach a lot of really abstract and high level concepts, sort of under the naive assumption that it will transfer broadly to lots of different domains, and underteach things in a kind of mode of apprenticeship. And I think that, there's certainly a place for doing the theoretical knowledge. I don't want to dismiss that, but I think we maybe have leaned too far in our kind of educational system where these things, students, if you ask them, have no idea how it applies to the real world. And it's very difficult to learn something in a productive way if you have no idea where it's ever going to touch base with reality. You're just going on faith. And so I think that there needs to be more dialogue. And so I would like to see more kind of training that's done in that light. But, considering I probably don't have the power to reform the entire education system, I think as an individual, that's going to be something that I lean on, that when I'm taking a class or reading a book, I'm going to be filling that in because I know that that's a bias of the system, that it tends to underrepresent the kind of practical consequences you care about.
So Scott, earlier we touched on books and reading more books, and I know that's something you've thought about recently. And I mean, what can people who are looking to say read more books in 2020, what kind of habits might they pick up?
Yeah. So one of the big habits that I have, which I say it because it's a little bit contrarian, because a lot of people, they like to keep track of how many books they read. I saw so many lists of like how many books I read in 2019. And if you ask me how many books I read in 2019, I have no idea. And the reason why is because I read like a lot of like 20% of books or 50% of books. Yep. And so my sort of contrarian point is never feel bad about starting a new book or stopping a book that's gotten boring. And the reason for this, and it sounds kind of contrary to the whole effortful approach of ultralearning, but it's really just the idea that I'm trying to maximize the amount of time I spend reading. If I want to really learn something because it's very important to me, then I can make a project out of it and really go for it. But if I'm just reading to increase the amount of things I know, increase the amount of reading I do, then I think that kind of easy on, easy off approach is good, because I think often what happens is we pick a book that we think we'll like, and then we get maybe we get excited. The first 50 pages are good, and then it gets to a slog. And I think when there's that friction, we just stop. And then the alternative is Netflix. The alternative is Facebook. The alternative is doing something that's not reading. And so recognizing that the thing that's going to prevent you from reading is not starting a new book. It's doing something that's not reading, I think, is a really big step you can take. So if you just get in the habit of reading books more kind of promiscuously, if you might want to say, and just sort of reading books and putting them down, picking them up. And then even, I finished a book I started reading in the summer. It was this memoir, Working Memories by Alan Badley, who kind of came up with some models in cognitive science. And I started reading it in the summer and it just didn't really engage me. And so I put it down. And then I finished it like about a week ago. I just picked it up and I'm like, oh, I should give that book another chance. And so I think having that kind of flexible approach is good because it allows you not only to expose yourself to more ideas, but even the research on spacing shows that, spreading out the intervals in which you expose yourself to the same ideas probably improves long-term retention. So I think even just from a learning standpoint, this approach to reading is probably beneficial.
Yeah. And I guess that aligns somewhat with, what James Clear says when it comes to building new habits. And I know he wrote the foreword to your book. Yeah. Like, for example, if I want to become more proficient at, say, running, but I have never run in my life, well, then I probably shouldn't start with a 10-kilometer run. I should just walk around the block, right?
Yeah.
And having that flexible approach and applying that to, say, reading more books or whatever the thing you want to do more of in 2020 is, and not being so hard on yourself, which, like you said, it does kind of fly in the face of what we're kind of talking about earlier in the sense that having that relationship with the difficulty, but at the same time, like not setting yourself up for failure from day one.
Well, for me, I like to split advice. So sometimes it's like something and its opposite are both true. So in this case, I am really a big believer of that. And it sounds paradoxical until you see that you're just approaching it differently. So there are some things in my life that I tend to approach in a, how do I make this as effortless as possible so I maximize my engagement? Because I know it's never going to be like, this is my priority of the moment. But then there's other projects where it's like, okay, this is what I'm doing right now. Let's really go for it and go all in. And so I think knowing how to balance those two modes is important, because if you do everything in the former, you might miss out on some things that they are going to require effort. I mean, I don't think you're going to learn quantum physics just by casually reading it on your own unless you're super smart. You're going to actually have to study it. You're going to actually have to work through some hard problems and stuff. On the other hand, if you make everything that kind of do or die, then you can often sort of sabotage yourself in that way because you're not able to really focus on it because you have 18 things that you're trying to do like that. And when you try to focus on 18 things, you don't actually focus on any of them. Yeah. So I think that both processes are kind of complementary. Now, in the book, I kind of emphasize the latter because I think the question I wanted to address there is, assuming you were kind of really trying to optimize for efficiency, how would you optimize your learning? And that's kind of the pure version of the question, because once you start adding in the issue of, well, I also want to make it enjoyable and convenient and easy, then you start diluting it. But I think you need to know what is the sort of the best way to do it. And then if you're diluting it, maybe you're not diluting it in ways that are too damaging to your overall effectiveness. I think there's ways that you can learn that are easier, that are still going to get you most of the way there. But then there's ways that are going to violate some of these principles and are really going to undermine you. So I think if you're studying a language, for instance, something where you have flashcards where you have to remember something from memory, you're going to be much better off than you're doing something where you're just tapping, multiple choice on your phone, even though, they're both kind of phone apps. So they're maybe not as good as having a conversation with someone.
Yeah. And, I mean, something you hinted at as well, Scott, was the fact that nowadays we have, our phones and we have Netflix and all these things at a touch of a button. Comfortable, they're easy, and they're a lot easier than sitting down to, say, learn quantum physics, for example. But I guess ensuring that what you're actually learning is meaningful to you, aligns with your objectives, aligns with your values, is going to get you closer to your goals, rather than just learning something for the sake of learning something can make all the difference, because then you're far more likely to actually sit down and commit to it than, watch the latest episode of Stranger Things.
Well, and I think this goes back to the idea we had about projects, because I think if you evaluate the kind of learning goals you have at the level of each individual task, well, there's an obvious reason you don't spend all your day learning, because you wanted to play the piano, but, well, you're not that good at it in the beginning. So if you just evaluated it based on that 30-minute session with the piano tutor, you're like ding, 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 you're doing that, and it's not that fun. It's not that cool. You're not too excited about it. But if you stick with it for 3 months and you really get involved and you really get invested in it and you make it a challenge for yourself, maybe you will really love playing the piano. And I think that's the thing that's missing when we take the kind of the myopic approach of just like whatever is most convenient in the moment, is that the moments in your life where you are happiest, where you're most fulfilled, where, you know, you feel alive, those aren't the moments sitting watching Netflix. Those are the moments where you are doing something that you didn't think was possible before. And, you know, I can say this for learning languages, for instance, that, you know, yes, it can be very frustrating in the beginning, but when you're having a conversation and you're sort of, you know, on some adventure that you would not have been able to do if you didn't speak that language before, there's just no other feeling like it. And similarly, if you're playing a sport at a competitive level that you would, you know, you didn't know how to do it before, it's really fun. And so I think this sort of long-term vision requires a kind of project and setup, because if you just evaluate it at like, well, would it be more fun to start learning piano right now or watch another episode of The Office, you kind of know which is going to win.
Yeah. So Scott, I guess I wanted to wrap up on rituals and routines, which is a question I ask all of my guests, just to find out a little bit about how you stay on top of your game. Do you have any daily rituals or routines that you partake in?
Yeah, so I tend to alternate my rituals, so which maybe makes them not as much rituals as they should be. But I find that I get into sort of distinct modes. So I'll give an example. When I was writing the book, sort of my main ritual was I would wake up and I didn't even have breakfast. I would like leave the house at 8 a.m. to go to this particular coffee shop to write. And this was because I like really would struggle with procrastinating with writing a book. If anyone's ever written a book before, they can empathize with me that, I have to deliver this book and it's, you know, an important sort of milestone for my career. And this, you know, writing has to be good. Yeah, that can be kind of terrifying. And so getting out to that coffee shop was just like one of the most important things of the day, and I would do it just sort of on a regular basis. And then, you know, even if I like finished by the afternoon and okay, I'm done writing or researching for the day, I would have gotten in a couple hours or 4 or 5 hours of really focused work in. Other little kind of habits I've been having for the last couple of years. I have a habit of doing 50 push-ups a day. And it's just a really minor thing, but I found I was traveling and going places, and then it would be like, well, I'm not going to go to the gym right now because I don't have access to it. And so this became kind of like a placeholder exercise habit for when, you know, a fuller workout wasn't there. And so I think little things like that can often be very beneficial. I've used them for learning too. And I'm trying to practice Mandarin Chinese. I often would have like a 10-minute a day. Okay, I'll listen to audio for 10 minutes a day. And it just becomes a placeholder activity for more further investments that you might want to make even when you're busy and don't have time.
Yeah. And I like the example of just going out to that particular place 8 a.m. every day while working on your book. And it kind of echoes what Ben Mesrick said when I had him on my show. And, you know, he wrote books like Accidental Billionaires and Bitcoin Billionaires. And his thing was just write 6 pages a day, commit to that, lock yourself in a room. And if it takes an hour, great. If it takes 10 hours, so be it. But he will not come out until those 6 pages were done. And by applying that approach, he's able to crank out his books in something like 6 to 8 weeks. And they still go on to be like New York Times bestsellers. But I thought that was an interesting approach.
Well, I write considerably slower than that, but I do think that's really good advice, because I think the more you can kind of give yourself these little constraints, that I think that's one of the things that a lot of us view things like motivation and discipline and willpower and drive as being internal to the person, that, you know, this person is really motivated or this person is really disciplined. And I often think that they're often functions of the environment that we're in, that we kind of, these sort of invisible parts of our surroundings just naturally guide us towards certain actions. So the more you can pay attention to that, the more it can be beneficial. I mean, for me, if I don't go to the coffee shop, or if I didn't go to the coffee shop when I was in that phase of my writing, I would not do a lot of writing. I would find ways to not do writing. But when I'm at the coffee shop, it would just kind of click into place, because what else am I going to do there, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's an associational thing. You associate that place with writing. So when you're there, your brain just switches into gear and off you go. Perfect. Well, Scott, this has been a fascinating conversation. People can find out more about you over at scotthyoung.com, as well as on Twitter at scotthyoung. They can pick up a copy of the book Ultralearning, Master Hard Skills, Outsmart the Competition, and Accelerate on Amazon, and where all good books are sold. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say, if you are interested in checking out the book on Audible, I narrate it. So if you're not sick of listening to me talk, you can listen to me narrate the book as well.
Fantastic. We'll add that link to the show notes for our audience. Thank you so much, Scott.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Gliveski and on Instagram at TheSteveGliveski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.